A father wakes up before sunrise. The house is still quiet. The kitchen light turns on. Coffee. A quick breakfast. Then the door closes softly behind him. He does this every day. Years of early mornings. Years of careful saving. Years of saying maybe later to small pleasures. Not because he loves money, but because he loves something else. A simple dream. One day, his children will have an easier life than he did. And in many families, that dream actually comes true. The next generation grows up with more stability, more opportunities, more comfort. But here is the quiet paradox. Sometimes, the very comfort parents worked so hard to build changes how the next generation understands money. Not because anyone did something wrong, but because each generation grows up in a completely different financial world. Across countries, cultures, and income levels, most parents share a very similar hope. They want their children's lives to be a little easier than their own. You can see this in countless ordinary moments. A mother working overtime so her child can attend a better school. A taxi driver setting aside small amounts each month for future tuition. Parents taking extra shifts when the family first starts building a life. Not for luxury, not for status, but for opportunity. Many parents quietly trade their own comfort for their children's future. They skip vacations. They delay buying things they want. They worry about bills their children never even know existed. And slowly, year after year, these sacrifices build something powerful. Stability, a stable home, predictable meals, educational opportunities, a sense that life is secure. But stability has an interesting psychological side effect. When children grow up surrounded by stability, the struggle that created it often becomes invisible. They see the house, they see the comfortable life, but they rarely see the long road that built it. And that quiet gap between effort and outcome is where the story really begins. When people talk about financial struggles across generations, the explanation often sounds simple. Some say the younger generation just spends too much, but the reality is usually more complex than that. Sometimes the story begins with something very ordinary. Imagine a teenager growing up in a comfortable home. There's always food in the refrigerator. The electricity bill is never discussed at the dinner table. When something breaks in the house, it simply gets fixed. From the teenager's perspective, this feels normal. Not luxurious, just normal life. Now imagine the same home 25 years earlier. Before the stability, before the savings, before the promotions at work. At that time, the parents might have been making very careful decisions. Should we repair the car this month or wait? Should we move to a smaller apartment to save money? Can we afford that school trip? Those questions rarely reach the children, and that creates a quiet psychological effect. Children grow up seeing the result of stability, but not the process that created it. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a form of effort blindness. Not because children are ungrateful, but because the human brain naturally treats its environment as the starting point. What we grow up with feels like the baseline. And this is where something subtle begins to happen. When stability becomes the baseline, the emotional meaning of money starts to change. For someone who has experienced financial stress, money often represents safety. But for someone who has always lived inside stability, money can feel more like a tool, a way to explore, a way to experience life. Neither perspective is wrong. They are simply shaped by different experiences. Many parents believe that by protecting their children from financial stress, they are giving them a stronger foundation. And in many ways they are. But protection can also create distance. Distance from the story of how that stability was built. Distance from the effort behind everyday comfort. And when that story is missing, something important can disappear with it. Context. Take a simple example. A young professional orders dinner through a delivery app after work. It costs a little more than cooking at home. For them, it feels like a normal convenience. But their parents might remember something different. They remember planning meals carefully, cooking almost every night, stretching ingredients so nothing was wasted. Two very different relationships with the same everyday decision. And both make sense within the environment each generation experienced. Behavioral economists often point out that our perception of value is deeply influenced by our past experiences. When effort and scarcity are part of our memory, money feels heavier. Each dollar carries a story. But when stability has always been present, money can feel lighter, more flexible, more fluid. And this psychological shift happens quietly. No dramatic moment, no obvious change. just a gradual difference in how the brain interprets effort, comfort, and value. And this raises an interesting question. What happens when a generation grows up with comfort, but without the story of the effort that created it? The answer helps explain why some families maintain stability across generations, while others slowly lose it over time. To understand that, we need to look at another powerful force shaping financial behavior, something psychologists often describe as adaptation. There is another psychological force that quietly shapes how people think about money. It happens so slowly that most of us barely notice it. Psychologists often call it adaptation, or simply getting used to things. When living standards improve, what once felt like a luxury slowly becomes normal. Think about something simple: air conditioning, high-speed internet, streaming entertainment, food delivery apps. A few decades ago, many of these things felt like special conveniences. Today, they often feel like everyday expectations, and this shift happens in families too. When parents work hard to create stability, their children grow up inside that stability, not as an achievement, but as the starting point of life. Now, something interesting begins to happen. Our brains are not very good at judging value in isolation. Instead, we judge value by comparison. We compare our lives to the people around us: friends, classmates, co-workers, neighbors. And today we also compare ourselves to something else: the endless stream of lifestyles we see online. Imagine a young professional scrolling through social media after work. They see a friend traveling abroad, another friend moving into a new apartment, someone else sharing photos from a weekend getaway. None of these moments are necessarily extravagant, but when seen together, they can create a powerful illusion. It begins to feel like everyone else is constantly upgrading their life, and slowly, almost invisibly, expectations rise. Not because someone planned it, but because comparison quietly resets the baseline. There is also a neurological layer to this. Every time we anticipate something new, a package arriving, a trip being planned, a new device being unboxed, our brain releases a small amount of dopamine. Dopamine is not only about pleasure, it is closely connected to anticipation, the feeling that something rewarding might happen soon. Modern consumer environments are very good at triggering that feeling. Notifications, flash sales, limited time offers, convenient one-click purchases, all designed to make a spending feel immediate and satisfying. At this point, you might recognize a small moment from your own life. Maybe it is ordering food after a long day because it feels easier. Maybe it is upgrading a phone that still works. Maybe it is buying something small online simply because it feels satisfying in the moment. None of these choices are unusual. They are part of everyday life in modern economies. But when comfort, comparison, and convenience combine together, something subtle can happen. The emotional weight of spending slowly becomes lighter, and over time that can change how people relate to money. A better life does not only increase comfort, it can also increase the cost of maintaining what feels normal. Which brings us to another quiet piece of the puzzle. If comfort becomes normal and comparison keeps raising expectations, what helps people develop a lasting sense of financial perspective? The surprising answer often has little to do with income, and much more to do with conversation. And this is where many loving families accidentally create confusion. Up to this point, the pattern might sound familiar. Parents work hard. Children grow up in more comfort. Expectations slowly rise. But there is another piece of the puzzle that often stays hidden. In many families, money is rarely talked about, not because it is unimportant, but because parents want to protect their children from financial stress. So they handle the bills quietly. They worry privately. They solve problems without involving the rest of the family. From a parent's perspective, this often feels like love. If children do not have to worry about money, life feels safer. But this protection can have an unexpected side effect. When children never see the financial decisions behind everyday life, they never learn how those decisions are made. Imagine a common situation. A young adult tells their parents they are thinking about moving to a bigger apartment. The new place looks beautiful, more space, better location, closer to friends. From the young adult's perspective, the decision feels exciting, maybe even obvious, but the parents may react differently. Not because they dislike the apartment, but because their minds automatically run through a different checklist: monthly rent, emergency savings, unexpected expenses, long-term stability. Two completely different mental calculations happening at the same moment. Both reasonable, both shaped by experience. This is where many families begin to misunderstand each other. Parents may feel their children are being careless. Children may feel their parents worry too much. But often the real difference is not personality. It is exposure. One generation spent years making difficult financial trade-offs. The other generation grew up seeing mostly the finished result, the stable home, the comfortable life, the outcome without the context. Sometimes the next generation does understand the sacrifice, but understanding it emotionally is not always the same as knowing how to build healthy financial habits around it. And this leads to an important realization. Financial habits are not only learned through rules, they are learned through observation, through small conversations, through seeing how decisions are made. When families talk openly about money, children slowly learn something deeper than numbers. They learn how to think, how to weigh choices, how to consider both the present and the future. But when those conversations never happen, something subtle can be missing. Not intelligence, not discipline, but perspective. Most parents are not simply trying to build wealth. They are trying to build security. And most children are not trying to waste that security. They are simply navigating a different world. A faster world, a more connected world, a world where expectations and opportunities look very different. Understanding that difference is the first step toward closing the gap between generations. But there is another pattern that researchers and historians have noticed. Some families manage to pass stability from one generation to the next for decades, sometimes even longer, while other families slowly lose that stability within a generation or two. So what makes the difference? When people study families that maintain stability across generations, they often discover something surprising. The difference is rarely just money. It is not only income, not only investments, not only luck. Often the real difference lies in something less visible: family culture. More specifically, how families share stories about money. In many stable families, money is not treated as a secret. It becomes part of conversation. Children hear stories about the past, how their parents started with very little, how difficult decisions had to be made, how mistakes were corrected, how plans changed when life did not go as expected. These stories do something powerful. They turn money from an abstract number into a human experience. Instead of thinking we have always lived like this, the next generation begins to understand. This stability was built. Consider a simple example. A father sits with his teenage daughter one evening. They review the monthly household budget together, not because the family is in financial trouble, but because he wants her to understand how everyday decisions are made. He explains the mortgage, the emergency fund, why the family saves before spending. At first, the daughter finds it a little boring. Numbers, bills, planning. But years later, when she moves into her own apartment, something interesting happens. She begins making similar kinds of decisions, not because someone forced her, but because she had seen the process before. The stability she grew up with now has a story attached to it. This is one quiet difference between families that maintain stability and those that slowly lose it. In one family, money remains invisible. In another family, the thinking behind money becomes visible, not as pressure, not as lectures, but as shared understanding. Money can be transferred quickly. Perspective is usually passed down more slowly. Financial stability is rarely built in a single moment. It grows from thousands of small choices. Save a little here. Delay something there. Plan for the future. Adjust when life changes. When the next generation understands the story behind those choices, something powerful happens. They do not just inherit comfort. They inherit context. At the beginning of this story, we talked about a simple dream. Parents working hard so their children can live an easier life. It is a dream that appears in families everywhere, in large cities, in small towns, across cultures and generations. A parent saving quietly. A parent taking an extra shift. A parent worrying about bills late at night while the rest of the family sleeps. All driven by the same hope, that the next generation will start life a little further ahead. And in many cases, that hope becomes reality. Children grow up in safer homes, with more opportunities, more stability, more choices. But over time, something subtle can happen. The effort that built that stability slowly fades into the background. Comfort becomes normal, and the story behind that comfort becomes harder to see. But when families pause to share those stories, something powerful changes. The house becomes more than a house. It becomes a story of patience. The savings account becomes more than a number. It becomes a story of discipline. Even ordinary routines begin to look different. Cooking dinner at home, paying bills on time, setting money aside for the future. Small actions that quietly built the life the next generation now enjoys. When those stories are shared, money stops being just a financial tool. It becomes part of a family history. Maybe you can think of a moment from your own life, a habit your parents had, something that seemed ordinary at the time, saving receipts, planning expenses, fixing things instead of replacing them. At the time, it may have seemed unnecessary, or even frustrating. But years later, those small habits often begin to make more sense, because they were never just about money. They were about protecting stability. Perhaps this is the deeper meaning of a better life. Not simply more comfort, not simply more convenience, but more understanding. Understanding the effort behind the stability we experience. Understanding the choices that quietly shaped our opportunities. Every generation faces a slightly different version of the same challenge, learning how to care for the life they have inherited. So here is a simple question. If you grew up in a family that worked hard to build stability, what is one lesson about money that stayed with you? And if you are someone who is now building stability for the next generation, what story would you want them to understand one day? Because in the end, the most valuable inheritance is rarely just money. It is the story behind how that money was earned, protected, and passed forward. And when those stories continue to be shared, each generation does not just inherit comfort, they inherit wisdom,